would be a thought-provoking discussion with our wonderful panel of guests. So my name is Imran Abdullah. So I'm a volunteer for the Leicester MEND working group. For those of you that are not aware, MEND is an acronym for Muslim Engagement and Development. We are a community-inspired, community-run, and 100% community-funded organization. Now, as an organization, we are passionate about tackling all forms of hate crime, particularly Islamophobia. Every November, MEND runs Islamophobia Awareness Month. Now, this is a month where we highlight both the issues Muslims face and the positive contributions Muslims make to society. This gives us a chance to showcase some of the amazing things that Muslims have done over the previous year and outline what needs to be done to tackle all forms of Islamophobia, from the school playgrounds through to the workplaces. So before we dive into this event, I want to share a short clip that does a much better job at explaining Islamophobia than I could do. So I'm gonna hopefully hold out for technology and we'll share this clip with you all.
We want the children in our schools grow up in a society where love, not hate, dominates.
See, the media send a lot of stuff out that's negative. Well, we need to counteract that. All of us, where we sit, counteract that.
We cannot become complacent, and we must tackle hatred in all its forms.
Let's share together, let's keep it together, and let's stand together.
It's all of our jobs to stand up to Islamophobia whenever we see it, and to raise awareness of the wider and systemic ways in which it can manifest itself too.
This is a time to stand up for our rights, to speak out against Islamophobia, to stand in solidarity by minorities wherever they are.
I support Islamophobia Awareness Month. It is vitally important. I hope you do too.
So hopefully that video sets a bit of context of why we're here today and why we do what we do as MEND, and why I volunteer and people like Shaukat spend so much time with MEND. So let's move on to our topic of discussion for today and the rest of this hour. So the key line is what needs to be done to eliminate all forms of racism, racial discrimination, racial profiling, Islamophobia and xenophobia from our communities. Now, to explore this, I have three incredible guests. Claudia Webb, MP for Leicester East; Ross Wilmot, Labour's Police and Crime Commissioner candidate; and Shaukat Adam Patel, volunteer and chair of Leicester branch of the MEND working group. So Shaukat has kindly stepped in for Rupert Matthews, who unfortunately couldn't make it today. So a bit of bio for around our guests before we crack on. So Claudia has served as a Member of Parliament for Leicester East since 2019. Born and brought up in Leicester, she studied social science at De Montfort University, followed by a master's degree in race and ethnic relations at Birkbeck, which was super close to my university, UCL, where I studied engineering. So she was previously elected an elected member and cabinet member for energy, environment and transport in the London Borough of Islington, and was a member of the National Executive Committee for the Labour Party from 2016 to 2019. Some notable achievements include being the chair of Operation Trident's Independent Advisory Group, a community-led initiative created in the mid-1990s to tackle the disproportionate effects of gun violence on Black communities, something pertinent to the topic that we're discussing today. Moving on to Ross. So Ross lives in Belgrave and has for most of his life lived locally. He is best known as a local councillor, a position he has held since 1985, and for becoming leader of the City Council in 1999. Ross runs a successful business supporting charities and was for many years a volunteer for people with learning disabilities. He has also worked as a lecturer and research fellow in higher education and holds both a first and master's degree. Now, Ross has been a member of the Labour Party for 48 years. Ross, correct me if I'm incorrect, and recently was selected as Labour's candidate for Police and Crime Commissioner. Last but by no means least, Shaukat Adam Patel. So Shaukat has been volunteering for MEND for 5 years now and has worked on a broad spectrum of different areas. So one of the most high-profile cases that he worked on was that of Zainab Hussain, which I'm sure many of you have heard of in Leicester, and was one of the worst hate crimes we've seen in Leicester in the area of Beaumont Leys. Alongside that, he's really passionate, and I've seen firsthand the work that he does with community. He's done countless presentations around media and politics for volunteers like myself and the wider community, and he works really closely with the masjids in Leicester and does an incredible job. So let's start with you, Shaukat, and let's crack into the debate because that's what everyone's here for. So if you could, Shaukat, provide some context on the topic, both at a community and wider level, please.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I don't think I'll ever hear it again, so I should have recorded it. First of all, thank you very much for joining us, for everybody at home. And particularly, I'd like to use this opportunity to thank Claudia and Ross, two extremely busy individuals, to come and discuss what I feel is possibly a subject matter that is the most important in the world. We had an event a week or so ago, and it was a scholar who mentioned that we are in the middle of a pandemic, and it has unfortunately taken the lives of so many people. But racism through the centuries and even today has been the cause of so many more lives that have been lost and will be lost if we do not tackle it. So once again, from myself as the chair of MEND, I'd really like to thank Claudia and Ross for joining us today and taking and giving the seriousness to this matter. So as you correctly introduced me, Imran, I am a volunteer, I have a day job, and I have a young family. And that is precisely why I give up my time to address this issue, because we know anybody that has been a student of history, even not of any context or level, will know that when racism or bigotry or any form of phobia raises its ugly head, it is not only the victims of that racism that will suffer, but society as a whole will suffer. And we don't have to go far back in history. Now, for people who know me personally are very surprised that I am involved in such endeavors, because I have always been, and hopefully will always be, somebody that is more than a half full kind of person. I'm a positive individual. I see the good and I see the positivity in everything. And yet sometimes it comes across that we are in such a situation. And when we hear stories of Zainab Hussain and lots of others that I'm sure we'll be touching upon today, that have we come to the point of, or past the point of no return. So the reason why I volunteer, and the reason why it's so important to have these discussions and so important to have Islamophobia Awareness Month, my own examples, why have I joined MEND? Why do I volunteer? Why do I encourage people like yourselves and other people in the community to engage? As every single day of my life, of my working life, I commute to work. I get into my car, I turn on the radio, allegedly highbrow radio, Radio 4, Radio 5, and I think there'll be many people who will be able to relate to this, that every day there's a story about the Muslim community or the Muslim faith, whether it'll be an international event, whether it'll be a national event, whether it'll be a local event, whether it'll be an overtly cultural event, yet it would be presented in such a way that I know that if I wasn't a Muslim and I wasn't born into this faith, which I just happen to be, by the end of my journey, I would be having serious doubts and questions about people who follow this faith. Okay, then I get to work. I've got lovely staff, but I can't really control what they read. So they will have the Daily Mail. As I had one member of staff who would read the Daily Mail religiously every day. And if you flick through the Daily Mail, You will certainly find a story about minorities. You will certainly find stories about people from foreign lands. And more often than not, you will find negative stories about the Muslim community or Islam per se. So there you've had the radio, then somebody picks up the newspaper and has a read of newspaper. When you get home, you sit down and watch television and you see international events framed in such a manner that, again, there's a negative light being portrayed about the Muslim community. So when you add all this up, we're not even talking about institutional aspects, government policies, etc. I'm just talking about the media here. I felt that if I was John sitting in Devon or wherever, who has never met a Muslim individual in his life, drinking his cider, and was to be exposed to this, what perception would he have of Muslims? You know, there's the study that was done by Lancaster University, which is published by Cambridge Press, that we quote often, that for when the research was done for the main major newspapers, tabloids, and broadsheets in this country for a period of, I think, 6 years, that one moderate, not even positive, one moderate mention of a Muslim was counterbalanced by 21 negative stories. Now, you know, if you hear 21 negative things about myself and one moderate thing, no matter how balanced the individual you are going to have a negative concept, a negative impression of that individual. You know, it's just human nature. This is my home, and I'm proud that this is my home. You know, I have been bred in this country. I grew up in this country. I wasn't born here, but I am shaped by this country. Okay, I've been fortunate enough to travel the globe, but where would I live anywhere else? It'd be very difficult. Nobody would understand my sense of humor because that's come from this country. My children don't know anything else. This is their home. They go to bed when it's tournament time, sleeping with their England top on. Yet they have been subjected to Islamophobia abuse in the playground. See, they have been subjected to my concerns as a parent that son or daughter, you know, maybe you don't want to discuss this issue too vociferously because you're a Muslim, and they may think, you know what, why is he talking so much passionately about politics? Because of certain government policies that treat Muslims under suspicion because of their political activity. And this is something that we must all avoid in order to ensure that the horrors that have visited us, not in the very recent past. You know, we look at Srebrenica, we look at Bosnia, we go to Africa, and we saw what happened to brothers and sisters in Rwanda when one society, one part of the community was demonized. Yeah, we go further back and we saw what happened to the Jewish community. They were demonized for so many years. Now, I believe in the good people of this country, but I believe that we really need to get together and challenge the issues. And I can give you statistics, but statistics are one thing. These are people that we know and that I know that have been affected. You know, we have, if my daughter decides to wear a hijab, there'll be plenty of things for me to worry about her anyway. The last thing I want to worry about is she going to be attacked because of a piece of clothing that she wears? And when this is endorsed sometimes from the top, it becomes very, very difficult. That is why I volunteer. That is why I suspect you volunteer, and we have such a wonderful team in Leicester and up and down the country to challenge Islamophobia for the safety, not just for the Muslim community, but for everybody.
Thanks, Ashok. I think that would resonate with so many Muslims, and not just Muslims, ethnic minorities within this country. Ross, I'll pass over to you for some thoughts on how do we overcome this? How do we bridge these gaps in these divides in society and minimize these intolerances between different communities?
Thank you, Imran, and assalamu alaikum to everybody. And thank you very much to MEND for inviting me. Is it okay? Can you hear me? All right. Good. Just checking. Really, I mean, I understand and agree with what Shokat has just said, and I suppose in this very short talk, I want to look at why I think racism still exists in the world, and what are the fundamental causes, and what should we be doing about it in a practical way, and hopefully I'll be able to illustrate that when we come to the questions and so on. So why does racism exist in our world? And let me be clear from the start. I know it does. That's my starting point. It exists at the level of personal prejudice. Individuals hold it, and it exists at the level of institutions, what we call institutional racism or discrimination, where whole organizations have a culture, whether even when they're not aware of it, that discriminates against people by virtue of their race or color, or even their, of course, their ability or gender, and so on. After all, I mean, I think so why is this, given that after all, we now understand, through science, that we all come from the same place. The oldest person that's been found on the planet is a 4.5 million year old African woman skeleton, from which we are all descended in some form or another. That history teaches us that people have been oppressed because they are different over hundreds of years, as Shaukat was saying, never more so than in the slavery that drove the economic prosperity of the 18th and 19th centuries. We know that, we understand it. Minorities have been scapegoated for centuries: Jews, Huguenots, Black people, Muslims, Irish people, and so on. So we know that discrimination is wrong, scientifically, morally, and politically, and yet it's still with us. And it's quite extraordinary when you think of it like that. The huge body of evidence, both scientific and which tells us that we all come from the same place. We all have much more in common. We have the same blood, the same organs, and the history which illustrates the oppression for ends, but it's still with us. And I think some of that is because of the history. We are still living with the effects of European colonialization of the rest of the world, and the creation of capitalism as part of that. And I think the Black Lives Matters movement has reconnected the present with that historical discrimination and with its origins in society. And I think it's a very powerful reminder that much more needs to be done. And it's not gone away. It exists, and it's part of the institutions, and it's also part of the behavior of certain individuals. And I think we need to recognize those common facts and acknowledge them as the truth before we can go further in tackling racism, because it's about understanding. And I think that comes about because it's a combination of ignorance and the failure of people in leadership positions. And I'll say a bit more about that. We know that ignorance leads to fear, fear leads to blame and discrimination. Racism is learned. We're not born racist. If you see little children playing, of all colors and creeds, they do not behave in a racist way. So it's learned, and it's typified by false assumptions about people because of their color or their dress, or where they worship. It's fulfilled by, it's reinforced by superstition and by stereotypes and by generalizations, where we say, we take one instance and then say everybody. So, one disabled person drives too fast, so all disabled people must be mad drivers. It's that kind of daftness when you look at it like that. But it's applied to Muslims, and it's applied to Black people as well, and people do not challenge that ignorance. So we take with that ignorance that's there, and then we take that ignorance being reinforced, in my view, by leaders politically and by institutions. We saw that with the Macpherson report, and it's worth mentioning, it's a long time ago, Stephen Lawrence, the Macpherson report, but it found that the Metropolitan Police were institutionally racist. And leadership should be a way of finding a way for all of us to live together peacefully. There has been leadership that is good on the left: abolitionists of slavery, the suffragettes for women's rights, the race relations and sex discrimination acts, but it's not always there. In Trump, and in my view, Boris Johnson, that it's the opposite kind of leadership. It's a leadership that's divisive. It's not unifying, and it's not about the truth. Trump scapegoats minorities, blames them, whether they're Mexicans or Africans. They are all the people that he blames for everything. And Johnson, stereotyped Muslim women in an incredibly insulting way. Now, these are powerful people. And if those messages are going out from powerful people, then looking at your man in Devon, was it Shock or Somerset? You know, he's getting those messages, and he's not getting experience or the truth. So these acts sow division, and I think that sometimes leaders want to perpetuate the status quo. They're not interested in changing things, which is another thing. So even when confronted with this kind of racism, they don't do anything about it. Just one thing that was interesting from my experience, at the time of Macpherson, it was 1999 when I first became leader of the city council here in Leicester. And so I had a bit of a choice, you know, did I sort of leap into my fortification and stand there and say, well, you know, I've surrounded myself with equal opportunities policies and positive action programs, and say that the city council wasn't institutionally racist. And that'd be very defensive, of course, but you can understand why, as a Labour politician who's had a long track record in fighting racism, I might do that. But I felt that I wouldn't do that. I think I acknowledge that it's quite likely that the city council in Leicester was institutionally racist, and saw this instead as an opportunity to do more to combat racism, not as an opportunity where I needed to respond by being defensive and pulling up my drawbridge and surrounding myself with equal opportunities policies. I think, you know, once you start to see and read what Macpherson did, and from that point we did a lot more, and I'll perhaps come to that when we deal with questions by looking at examples. I think that that would always be my approach. Start from an assumption that there's more we could do, and that would be my approach as Police and Crime Commissioner, and my approach to the police. And the police there's a long way to go. It's not like it was when I first got into politics, 40 years ago, when I was demonstrating against the British National Party and was arrested in Leicester. I might be the only Police and Crime Commissioner candidate to have been arrested demonstrating against racist parties that were then very active in Leicester. And of course, we haven't even touched on those messages from leaders that are reinforced by social media, hugely reinforced. And I think, as Barack Obama called it, truth decay, which is an interesting thing, where these false messages and untruths are put out all the time, and actually it destroys the truth that that's out there that we know about people, and gives rise to things like Islamophobia and hate. But things can change. There has been progress, and there will be resistance to progress. But I do think that we fight ignorance with truth and fear with understanding. So education is always key. And I very much welcome the work of MEND in promoting understanding of this important work, which contributes, in my view, to a more just and peaceful world, recognizing that we have more in common that separates us. And I'll just finish with a big name drop, if I might. And that Nelson Mandela, I was in Johannesburg for the World Earth Summit in 2003, and we went to the party of us on a bus, a coach from Joburg to Tshwane, and Nelson Mandela came down the bus and sat next to people, and I asked him a question about, well, what would he say, just one thing, and he said to me, and I remember that, Ross, it's better to build a future that is fair than to try and change the past. So it is about recognizing that every day in every act that we need to challenge racism, we need to practice understanding and working with people, and we need to challenge stereotypes, we need to challenge prejudice, and we need to be kind to people, we need to understand difference and celebrate it, and not to be fearful or scared, and not to seek to apportion blame to minorities and scapegoat people just because they are different. And I think that's my kind of message, and I think we can do that. So thank you very much.
No worries, Ross. That's some name drop. I think we'd all struggle to beat that. But I think, on a serious note, you touched on some really, really interesting aspects: the origins of racism, the role of education, the role of community groups, leadership, especially institutional racism. These are all things that hopefully in the Q&A we can dive a little bit deeper and get a bit of a discussion going on. So before we do that, Claudia, last but definitely not least, do you want to open up with some thoughts on the subject matter? Sorry, I think you're on mute, so.
Well, first of all, just let me just thank and sincerely thank MEND for actually welcoming me to this important event, really to mark Islamophobia Awareness Month and to consider how we tackle all forms of racism, both here in Leicester and across the UK. I'm incredibly proud, of course, to represent the incredibly diverse area of Leicester East. I bring some history, of course, to this agenda, being the first Black female member of Parliament for Leicestershire, perhaps even the county of the East Midlands, rather. But obviously, Leicester East is incredibly diverse. Well over 20% of residents are Muslim, and I'm fortunate to experience firsthand the many important ways in which the Islamic community contributes to our collective religious, cultural and political life. As the representative, of course, for Leicester East, one of the most diverse constituencies in the country, it's been extremely concerning, however, to see the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus, COVID-19, upon African, Asian and minority ethnic communities, which obviously includes members of the Muslim, Jewish, Hindu and Sikh religions. The Office of National Statistics found that tragically, Muslims have the highest death rate of any religious groups in the UK, at more than twice the rate of those with no religion. And I would also just like to express my solidarity with the Muslim community for the difficulties, of course, the community has faced regarding burials during this pandemic. I can only imagine how hard it must be for grieving families to not be able to follow important burial methods which are in line with long-standing religious practices. So we have a situation where, rather than the government protect at-risk and marginalized communities, the government has really sought to scapegoat Muslims and African, Asian and minority ethnic communities from what I believe to be their own failures during the crisis. You heard earlier about the Black Lives Matter movement, but during the Black Lives Matter movement, the government has been using this historical moment actually to wage war against the accurate teaching of institutional racism in our schools. They've appointed people who do not believe in the existence of institutional racism as advisors to the Prime Minister and to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, sadly. I mean, to the extent that the Equalities Minister was able to stand up in Parliament and say that actually and just simply say that actually schools will be operating illegally if they taught anything about white privilege or critical race theory. I just couldn't even believe it myself when I heard that being expressed. I was shocked, in actual fact, by the despicable Islamic phobic comments made by a Tory MP who sought to blame Muslims and migrants for the extension of lockdown measures. We saw that when the North went into added measures. This formed part of a broader attempt to distract from actually the government's coronavirus failures by dividing our communities, which have been under significant strain and have made and who've made many sacrifices during lockdown. Indeed, this was reflected in a poll which found that almost half of Conservative Party members believe that Islam is a threat to the British way of life. By failing to condemn these comments or the rampant Islamophobia in his own party, the Prime Minister, who has a long record, as we know, a long history of Islamophobic comments, has once again demonstrated his own personal tolerance for racism. The government should be ashamed at their inflammatory attempts to actually deflect from their own failures. And of course, we saw that in Leicester, and it was very apparent here in Leicester after a resurgence of media reports highlighted abhorrent exploitation in sections of our garment industry. Shamefully, members of the government sought to distract from their own failures to protect workers with dog whistle allusions to racism and cultural sensitivities. This was an outrageous attempt actually to divide our communities, which have been under significant strain due to the extended lockdown. The exploitation of workers is a global issue, and I want us all to really understand this. The exploitation of workers is a global issue which transcends ethnicity, has nothing to do with ethnicity. Leicester's diversity is our strength, and we must reject the government's divide and rule tactics. When Tory ministers or members of the right-wing press punch downwards, they let the powerful and those responsible off the hook. At every step in this disastrous crisis, from lockdown delay, equipment shortages, care home neglect, testing delays, insufficient data, and much more, the government has failed to adequately protect our community. That's why we have the most excess deaths of any European country. And at a time when hate crime has more than doubled since 2013, this is the reality. And when powerful people are attempting to blame African, Asian, and minority ethnic communities for the government's mishandling of the coronavirus crisis, it has never been more important for our communities actually to come together and unite. We must oppose any attempt to divide us up based on nationality or religion. The task ahead of us, therefore, is not only to defeat the virus, but to build a world free of the inequalities which have exacerbated its brutal impact. Because after this crisis, we can no longer live in a society defined by extreme religious, racial, and class inequality. So I would just probably end by really just paying tribute to the countless Muslim organizations in Leicester and across the country whose voluntary work has been essential in getting us through this pandemic. It's been tremendous, the effort that has been put in. And I volunteered with Muslim food banks, and I'll say that as freely as that, in Leicester. And I know from personal experience the generosity, the selflessness, which is at the heart of the Islamic religion. That is why I'm incensed. I'm not concerned, I'm incensed by the government's appalling attempts to distract from their own failures by peddling divisiveness and discord. And I will do everything in my power to fight against the demonization of the Muslim community and to combat Islamophobia, along with, of course, all other forms of racism, wherever it appears. And I'll just end on that and look forward to the discussion.
No, thanks, Claudia. I think your talk got plenty of questions coming through, so it's good timing. I think the COVID-19 situation is something that we've never seen before in society, and the points you touched on and how it's driven hate crime and how it is potentially a medium that can be used for divisiveness, but then also how communities have come together to help overcome that is something that is so powerful. So that leads me, so again, just for our viewers, please keep posting your questions on Facebook. We'll try to get around to as many of them as we can. So panelists, I'm going to have to be a bit blunt and rude at times and start cutting answers off to try and get as many as we can in, because we've got plenty coming through. So let's continue on that role of community groups, religious groups, race groups, youth groups, and how they can help in overcoming divides in society. So I'll start with Shukka actually, and then we'll move across the panel on my screen. Do you think the government and policing has actually done enough to work effectively with groups like MEND and other groups to tackle racism and religious discrimination? So Claudia touched on some points, but what's your view?
Well, we could have a very short answer and say no. And even if we have, we need to do a lot more, especially from the government level, because I think Ross touched upon it with education, and Claudia compounded the discussion. There is a divide and rule attitude that has pervade throughout history, and they're demonizing a certain groups of Muslim and splitting us up between good Muslims and bad Muslims. But these are the people we work with. These are not the people we work with. Those that we work with, maybe even extremely high level, well paid, as Claudia said, don't even believe institutional racism actually exists. And then they sit on the panel and boards and go up and down the country trying to resolve an issue that they don't even believe exists in the first place. Okay, so we have a person in charge now who actually, on an open discussion, said being called the N-word, which I'm not going to say, is equivalent to being called fat. If somebody is fat, somebody is fat. So if somebody's, and this person is now involved in trying to resolve racism in this country. So, so basically the answer is no. And in order to ensure, as I said in my beginning statement, that we have a safer future for everybody, it starts with education, it starts with engagement, okay? And sometimes we are engaging with people we don't have to agree with everything that they say. One of the proudest things that I loved about this country growing up, especially going back to India and subcontinent and maybe some Arab countries, etc., was that people were free to say what they believed, and you were defeated by the folly of your argument, or the strength of your, or you won by the strength of your argument. Yet now, as Claudia said, they don't want us to teach anything, even at schools, that may question whether democracy is whether democracy is the only solution forward, whether white privilege actually exists, anything that might question and think, as students at school, at college, universities, that's what these places are for, thinking, expanding. How have we come to this situation where this is now acceptable? It doesn't even fill inches of the newspapers. They're too busy discussing something else of absolutely no relevance to modern day society, or an old story because the press wish to attack them. Yet issues like this are rights, are liberties, as you know, Ross met Nelson Mandela. These things are being eroded right in front of us. And yet we are too, and I'm talking about our community first of all, are too blind to see it. So therefore, that is the way. We start with education, we start with engagement, and we have to start, the government has to start working with grassroots Muslim organizations, not just MEND. Obviously, we're not a monopoly on this, but all grassroots organizations, that are community funded, that represent, we're not a homogenous group of people. We don't represent the 5% of the Muslim community, but there's enough Muslim organizations that represent their community with sincere interest. Otherwise, before we know, we'll be in a tin pot state country, and everything that we have fought for and believed in will be just a legacy that our children will read about in history books, if they still allow those history books to be printed.
I think so. I'm gonna double onto that question before we move on to Claudia and Ross. Apologies for both of you. Now you've got two questions to answer at once. So I've got a few figures here. So latest figures show 8% of police officers in Leicestershire are from a BAME background. However, 25% of applications come from the BAME community. On top of that, so I'm sure you've seen the recent Muslim Labour Network study that came out, and it found that 46% of Muslim members and supporters disagreed with the statement that I believe the Labour Party represents the Muslim community effectively. So those are the stats. So on top of the first question, how important is improving diversity actually within politics and policing to help build trust, build a relationship with these community groups to help us overcome racism? So let's go Ross first and then Claudia second.
Okay, thanks. That's big questions there. And I think the start from my experience here in Leicester, which has much, I think, to teach any government, particularly the current government, who are so willing to stereotype and sow division and blame, as Claudia and Shaukat have ably described. So how do we combat that in Leicester? We combat it because we know people, and we know the truth about people. I'll go back to my point about the truth. And when you know people, and when you meet with people, and you engage in the community, and you visit, and you talk, and you have friends who are Muslim, you have friends who are Hindu, you have friends who are Jews, then you realise actually that when people say, "Oh, well, they're all Muslims are bad, or all Jews are evil," then you realize that is not true, because you have direct experience. Now, And I think that that direct experience is very, very powerful. And if we could bottle it, that would be really helpful. But there is much we can do, and that is by sharing it. And over the last 4 decades, Leicester has become a more divided city, in the sense that it's more segregated than it was 20, 30 years ago. So that, in fact, if you look at schools, for instance, you'll find that some schools have largely a BAME population, and some are 99% white. And whereas actually that was much more mixed. And I talk to people in the community, the first and second generation people who arrived in Leicester, always valued the fact that they grew up, went to school in a very mixed environment. So they learned about different cultures, they learned about different religions, and they got friends from all sorts of backgrounds. But so one of the things we started doing was actually to get schools to partner up with each other and swap, and so make sure that young people met people from the whole city and didn't just stay in the school where everybody was the same color as them or like them or went to their own temple. And with that's expanded now, we have, you will have people visiting the mosques from different parts of the city. You have them going to the synagogue, to the Hindu temples, and I think that's what we should be doing nationally and internationally. Because if you actually understand and know the truth about people, then you can realize that the falsehoods that are perpetrated are not true. Now, I think I welcome what the Muslim Labour Network have said, because at least the Labour Party has accepted that this study done by the Muslim Labour Network has validity. It's not been denied. And it's important that we always look at ourselves. And if people are saying, and it's 20, was it, there was a large percentage who disagree with that, then that's something we need to address. It's not something we, again, start to say, oh no, they've got that all wrong. That is not the approach. The approach is, well, what's going on here? Let's understand it. And I think that's really, really important. I contrast that with the Conservative Party, I have to say, and no Conservative representative here this evening, and it'd be interesting if they could, we would be able to ask them, because Boris Johnson said he would launch an inquiry into Islamophobia when he stood as party leader and to become prime minister, and his party would launch an inquiry. That has never happened. He hasn't done that. He's gone back on his word, and it's been watered down. It's never taken place, and it's, so you have to take that as a denial that there's an issue. But if enough people say there's an issue, then there's an issue, and you have to talk with those people, understand what it is, and look at your own practices and progress. Now, coming on to the police issue, I mean, it is absolutely correct. I mean, there's and the government. I'm sorry, I agree with Shock about the government haven't done enough at all about any of these issues. But in terms of the policing, historically, the police has had incredibly poor representation from the communities that it polices, and that has to change. It is starting to change, and I, if I was Police and Crime Commissioner, would want to do a lot more than is currently being done to address that in terms of recruitment, but also in terms of progression. I mean, and we need to understand why the 25% applicants only turn into 8%. I think the figures were of people actually getting police posts, because that is an institutional racism or discrimination going on, in my view, and that's how I would approach that. And that we approach that by talking to people in those communities. We do it by talking with independently those 25% applicants and looking at their experience. And the police have started to do some of that. I know under Willie Bark, who's the Labour Police and Crime Commissioner, they've started to do interviews that are not based, starting to do applications that are based on video and not based on written applications. They've started to talk with people. I know Willie Bark about last week when he was talking to the Black Network group in the city and county, launched 3 initiatives: a mentoring scheme, a new training initiative, and I think the third one was to have community representatives that are paid in terms of making sure that they are able to put their views forward about their experience of both policing and what the culture of the police force service is like. So I think and he's going to fund those initiatives. So I mean, always test a politician. Really, my test of a politician is when they put money behind their words, because it's very easy for politicians to sit here and say, "Oh yes, well, this is all terrible. We'll do this, we'll do that."
Mm-hmm.
Will they commit the resources to make it happen? And Willie has said that. Whether it's enough or not, I hope to be able to find out if I get elected.
Yeah, I think there's questions coming asking exactly about what actions you're looking to push through, but we'll get to that in a second. Let's go Claudia next then.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I hope you can still see me as well. I mean, I'm reflecting that the question is, one, about policing, and two, about tackling this more generally. Is that right? I mean, if I just touch on policing slightly, I mean, look, we know that Black people disproportionately suffer from police use of force in the UK, are more likely to be charged and are overrepresented in the prison population. It appears the police can actually act with impunity, as they very rarely face criminal prosecutions, and increased representation would help to combat these inequalities nationally. But that isn't the whole story, because we know that institutions take a long time to change, and 93% of the police force are white. That is the reality. And I welcome the fact that in Leicestershire, I think there was a goal set earlier to try to ensure just 1 in every 4 of police staff members are from an ethnic minority. And currently, the reality, however, is just 1 in every 10, or I think it's something like 9.9% of the force's staff members are non-white. But of course, there's a 1 in 4, 25% diversity target has now been set with the aim of ensuring Leicestershire Police better reflects the local population. And I think that notion of better reflecting the population is something which all institutions need to try to address themselves to. Of course, we also know, as brothers and sisters, we also know that having Muslim faces, having Black faces, having African, Asian, minority ethnic faces in high places does not necessarily mean that change will occur. What you need to do is change the policies, the processes, the practices, the culture of these institutions as well. And that, sadly, is for somebody like myself, is taking far too long, because you know the tackling racism has been a lifelong journey that has beset me for a significant long time, because you know, born in Leicester means that actually I didn't face what Ross described earlier as a welcoming, diverse environment in school, where you were treated well, and that you were taught the truthful education about Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. We weren't taught the truthful education. We were made to feel embarrassed by who we were. We were made to feel that we didn't matter, that we lacked identity and pride. That's not how education was back then. And we know that, don't we? Because we know that in Leicester has a history of racism, which we had to overcome, because we had that history that came out of the Enoch Powell days. Because of course, in 1972, on the arrival of Asian refugees fleeing persecution from Uganda in 1972, what they were met with was the National Front bowed up by Enoch Powell and his spiteful campaign of divisiveness and propaganda and anti-immigration sentiment. So that in 1976, shamefully in Leicester, we had the local elections. This was the height of National Front political achievements, because in 1976 local elections, the National Front were able to secure 18% of the vote share. They aided and abetted shamelessly at that time by local Leicester councillors, of course. And so it's a painful history that we've come through in Leicester, because we had to fight back and oppose the far right, including in a significant way. And those of us who fought included the Indian Workers Association, and that, Claudia, in a sense, is the source of our pride. I wanted to tell that history because it's important to understand from where we've come, 100%. because we fought back, and we fought back in such a way that we said to the racists, the National Front that marched during that time, that racism will not pass through Leicester. And they sought to form a huge march, but we fought back. Not only did we fight back the National Front, but we fought the police at the same time as well, because they were trying to hold us back from challenging that level. I think the question just come off online that I think is absolutely bang on the subject topic. So how important is it that we educate children at a young age to tackle racism? What do we need to change in our curriculum? So all the history that you talked about there, like you said, was that taught in schools? No. So what do we need to make in a change? And I think if we keep it to 1 minute all, because we are quickly running out of time, and then it'll be good to get Shaukat and Ross's views as well. What we learned back then, what was key back then, was a sense of unity. We came together, not as African Asian minority ethnic communities, but Leicester. I grew up in Leicester knowing that we were all black. We were black because of racism. As African and Asian people, we fought together in unity against the racism that we were experiencing. We weren't just taking verbal abuse. We were taking what I call licks, heavy beating, going to and from school. That was our reality, and we united together as communities, as anti-racists, as African and Asians. Together, we fought back, and we were able to unite. And it's that sense of unity which is going to be so important in challenging racism going forward. And, you know, I grew up in that change also enabled, when we talk about policing, you know, I grew up at a time when the policing that happened post the uprisings was a policing that put police in our schools, in our communities, working with us. And there was a greater sense of community policing, of neighborhood policing, of working together. And we need to get back to that, of course, but we need unity and going forward with that.
So Shaukat, building on that then, do you have any advice for people? So this has come online. Do you have advice for people who come up against resistance when they challenge racism, Islamophobia? Ross, you can touch on this as well, because obviously you've had an experience of this in the past when you were protesting. So Shaukat, do you want to go first?
Can you just ask that again, Imran? If you come up against resistance.
So if you come up against resistance when you're challenging racism or Islamophobia in your community, in your society, do you have advice for all our viewers online?
And it goes back to your first question, it's education. If you are aware of what is in front of you, you know, sometimes the Muslim community do get, sometimes rightfully so, being very passionate, very angry. And if you're not equipped with the right argument, then you will fail. So you will need to know that 69% of children are being have racial names called against them, like terrorist and bomber. Hence, there is racism in the playground. And you will need to know that when a Muslim applies for a job, they are 3 times less likely to get an interview, despite the fact they send exactly the same resume as a non-Muslim does, as according to the BBC research. They need to know that if you submit a PhD application as a black or a Muslim or an Asian, you're less likely to get a PhD position as your white counterpart. So this is knowledge. So nobody can argue with the facts. Okay, so arm yourself with knowledge. You know, education is the most important thing, and then you can challenge any form of resistance. Work with your media. Work very, very importantly. Work with media and work with our elected members, whether they are of our political persuasion or not. That is the only way we're going to make changes.
Ross, any other further thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think the first question about, you know, schools and children is absolutely crucial. I mean, it has to be, everything has to start with young people, and what messages we put and have in schools and what we teach is absolutely fundamental. And I think following what Claudia described as her experience of schooling, I mean, that had a big influence, I think, and changed things. We set up, before my time, I was at school myself, and at university in the 70s. But they set up lots and lots of projects, the Multicultural Education Project, Racism Projects. All of the things these were well resourced and funded, teacher training for local councillors, training for staff, experiences for young people, bringing in outside speakers, visits to mosques, gurdwaras and temples. All of that is now not really taking place because of the cuts in funding and so on, and that has a very has a really negative impact, I think, because throughout the sort of late 70s to the 80s and 90s, this was going on, and I think we had a justifiable reputation as a city of cohesion and so on. But if you don't keep doing that work with every generation, you will lose that, and people, I think, take that kind of harmony, community relations, too much for granted. So I think that the other question about when challenging, it depends what circumstances you're in. You know, I mean, if you're one person trying to deal with 50 members of the National Front, you know, it could be quite difficult to to engage in a challenge. And having been in that situation, you know, and without the police helping in that situation either, and that was some time ago. But I think I did. It's interesting when people are very extreme views and put those views forward. I was once canvassing in Colville when I was standing for Parliament with David Lammy, and this chap came up and started abusing us. And so David Lammy walked up to him, put his arm around him. David Lammy is quite a big chap, so it's quite easy for him to do that. And said, "My friend, what is it that is troubling you?" He said, "Well, it's, you know," and he was very, very hostile, very, very racist, and that actually worked. But I mean, you can do that one-to-one, and but it's hard to do sometimes. And it was very interesting because, you know, it's about this experience. If people have got a prejudice and it's based and they're hateful about it, if you challenge them with, not by repeating that hate and reinforcing it, but by showing understanding, then sometimes that you can challenge that person's deep beliefs. But sometimes that's hard to do in the street. But you can do it in a more systematic way. And I do believe that we need to do it in the council and the council amongst local politicians more, because I actually feel that the political education of local politicians has again fallen off the agenda, and people do not understand these issues. And I think that, and then that infects the whole institutions of which they're responsible for governing, and that goes for the police as well, and all the people involved in that. And it's very important that that's throughout an organisation. It's not just those at the top. It has to be everybody involved working. Sorry, I've gone on too long.
No worries. I think, well, we've only got 2 minutes left and we've got about 13 questions to go through. So we're going to be struggling now. So I think, last question, I'm going to give you all pretty much 30 seconds because we have to cut off. What's the single most important change needed to overcome racism in all forms in society? Shaukat, you can go first, then Claudia, then Ross. 30 seconds each.
And this is a thesis for 30 years, really.
It is.
I think we have to first acknowledge there's an issue. We all have to work together for the betterment for the whole of society. I think we have to make people understand that racism even will affect them, even if they have nothing to do with it at the moment. So working together, education and engagement.
Perfect. Claudia, you've got literally 20 seconds.
Well, look, we must transform our British education system to teach the true history of colonialism, imperialism, and the transatlantic slave trade. Yeah. This racism is we're not talking about an individual act. We are talking about a global march of hate, funded and aided and abetted by global wealth. To ensure our downfall. Therefore, it's going to take a significant unity to overcome it. We can't just say that we're going to change our education system. We have a whole political system that is based on state-sanctioned racism. That is what was happening back in the 60s and 70s, and that is what's still happening now. So it's going to take some huge effort to bring about that change. So we do need to do something about the education system, but we also need to address things like the Windrush scandal. And of course, we also need to make Black Lives Matter a reality by proving that it does matter, not just say that it does. So we need to turn rhetoric into reality.
Ross, jumping to you. You've got 10 seconds now.
Right. It's very hard to come up with one thing. I agree with what Claudia has said, and I think we have to work together. We have to learn from the history of the past, the trade union movement that brought about the reforms that, which we take for granted now, that, and the movement that gave women the right to vote. And we learn from that and we work together. I think, and let's get back to our experience here in Leicester, could be a good building block for the kind of way in which the world should be at its best.
Totally agree.
And we can do that in a practical way. So unity is strength, as we say, and it certainly is in terms of dealing with racism.
No, it's been a pleasure. The hour has flown by. I think we could have gone for another 3 hours. Massive thanks to you all. Thank you to all the viewers. Loads of questions came in. Apologies if we haven't got around to it. Follow us, follow MEND, follow the activities we're doing, follow us on social media. And like I said, we can tackle hate crime together, and Leicester can be a real example in tackling that. So thank you all. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.